Chapter 16. From his jar, Inkling watched as Vidka lugged an old fish tank into her bedroom. She cleaned the glass surface carefully, then took a moment to stand back and admire her handiwork. She grabbed Inkling's jar, unscrewed the top, and dumped him into the tank. Still clinging to the crumpled piece of paper, he looked all around. There was no top on this tank. Quick as a cockroach, he darted off the paper and skidded across the glass floor. He hit the wall and with all his might, strained for the top. He rose only a few inches before sliding back down and spinning helplessly along the bottom of the tank. Vidka was peering at him. "You hungry?" A silly question. Of course he was hungry. He was starving. He hadn't had anything to eat since yesterday. He watched as Vidka went to her desk and ripped out a few bright pages from the comic book. She dropped it into his tank. He climbed onto it and looked drowning man hauling himself into a lifeboat. But then he hesitated. It reminded him how he'd been caught, how foolishly he'd been. But those colors, that ink, in a second he'd absorbed the entire page. "Tasty, huh?" Vidka said. He made no reply. He hadn't said a single word to her. "Did you want to draw something for me, please, Inkling?" He peered around the tank. The walls were too high to scale. All the seams were watertight. There was no getting out of this on his own. On a piece of paper, he wrote, "Where is Ethan?" He saw her eyes widen at first, writing message. Then she looked away guiltily. "He's not here right now. He loaned you to me for a while." Inkling felt a pang. Even though he knew she must be lying, Ethan would never do that. He was sure he'd heard Vidka yell something out the window at Ethan a few minutes ago. "I know it's you, Ethan." Did you mean Ethan was nearby? He had tried to rescue me? "If I draw, will you let me out?" "Yes, I'll let you out, but I need my dad to see too." Inkling didn't trust her. He had a plan. Vidka disappeared and returned with her father. He was holding a comic book and looked annoyed. He pointed at Inkling in the tank. "What's all this about? Just watch, okay? Go ahead, Inkling. Draw us something wonderful." Inkling gathered his thoughts, then whirled into action. He sent out 20 tendrils, all of them drawing in different parts of the paper. He was vaguely aware of Vidka and her dad watching in astonishment and confusion, until finally all the lines and colors met up. They were staring at the double-page spread. Exhausted, Inkling crouched tensely at the edge of the paper, waiting. "See," Vidka shouted at her father, "see what it does?" Mr. Worthington just stared, then started looking up at the ceiling and waving his arms above his head. "What are you doing?" Vidka demanded. "This is some kind of projection system, right? You're projecting onto?" "Dad, this isn't a trick." To help out, Inkling wrote, "This is the most certainly not a trick." "I can't believe it," Mr. Worthington said. And then he did exactly what Inkling hoped he'd do. He reached into the tank and grabbed the piece of artwork. "Dad," Vidka said, "don't!" But Mr. Worthington had already lifted the paper out of the tank, and he was peering at it. Instantly, Inkling darted across the paper and onto Mr. Worthington's hand. "He's on you," Vidka cried. "He's going to get away." "Where'd it go?" Mr. Worthington said, and then spotted Inkling on his sleeve. Vidka's dad swatted at him, and then like a mosquito. Inkling darted to the shoulder, then stretched straight out his shirt to his pants, and then off his shoe onto the floor. In the distance towered a stack of books. In a good hiding place, he bolted toward it. The jar came down on top of him so hard that for a few seconds Inkling couldn't even move. Stunned, he looked at the glass rims surrounding him, and not just surrounding him, but cutting through him. Most of him was inside the glass, but a small hunk of him was outside. Was it even connected to him anymore? Before he could try to slide himself back together, Vidka scraped the jar hard across the floor, tipped it right side up, and lifted it into the air. Inkling slid to the bottom of the jar, still too bewildered to move. But he could see a little severed piece of himself lying helplessly on the floor, getting farther and farther away. Vidka screwed on the top and placed the jar on her desk. Inkling kept staring. All he could think about was getting the little piece of himself back. It already looked so pale. Dimly, he was aware of Vitka and her father talking, fast and excited. "This is incredible," Mr. Worthington said, gazing at the artwork again. "It's so much like Peter's work. How long did it take? He's been using this thing." "Hey, look at this." Vitka knelt down and peered at the small ink splotch on the floor. "You cut a bit off," her father said, poking at it with his finger. "It didn't move." "Huh? I think it's dead." Dead? Inkling felt strange, hollow inside himself. Pushing against the glass, he strained to see. "No, look," Vitka said. It gave it a little shiver. Inkling had seen it too. Yes, it was definitely quivering, pale as ink mixed with water. "It needs food," Vitka said. "Food?" her father asked. "It eats ink." "Wow, okay. Here, try this," said her father, handing her a comic he walked in with. Inkling caught a glimpse of the cover. It was in Terminex. Vitka found a page with lots of colors. She slid it across the floor so just the edge touched the ink blotch. Inkling watched and waited. The pale splotch didn't move at first, but then shifted the tiniest bit onto the page. "It moved," Vitka shouted. Jerkily, the splotch pulled itself onto the page. Vitka carefully lifted the comic off the floor as if she had just captured a very delicate and rare beetle. She deposited the comic into the fish tank. "At last," thought Inkling, "she's being gentle with it." It was it now? Wasn't it part of him anymore? I was doing something without him. It was eating and didn't feel a thing. Something had been taken away from him. It was a small something, but its loss filled him with great sadness. "It's eating," Vitka said to her father excitedly. Slower than a snail, the pale splotch moved across the page, leaving a blank trail. "It erases," she said to her father. "Yeah, that's how it eats and learns, I think. Since it eats something, it knows how to draw it." "Is that right?" Mr. Worthington went quiet a moment. "So it would be able to duplicate this comic if it ate all of it?" Vitka nodded. "Maybe, if it survives," said her dad. The ink had stopped now, like it was already exhausted. "It doesn't look quite so pale," said Vitka. Mr. Worthington looked back at Inkling in the jar. "At least that one's fine." "He tried to escape," Vitka said. "I don't think he wants to draw for us." Mr. Worthington walked across to the jar and tapped the glass. Inkling glared back. He wanted to write rude things, but there wasn't even any paper in this jar, and he couldn't draw on a slippery glass. "If Inkling drew for Peter Rylance," said Mr. Worthington, "I don't see why he wouldn't draw for us, too." I'm calling Carl right now," Dad said after Ethan told him that Vitka had stolen Inkling. "This is outrageous." Maybe she hasn't even told her dad. Ethan knew how ambitious Vitka was. She wanted to be a famous artist. She was already really good, but she wouldn't be able to resist using Inkling and passing the work off as her own. Ethan let out a breath, just like he'd done, and his own father. "You think they'll give him back?" "Of course, it's simple theft." Dad dialed and held the phone to his ear. "There are laws, intellectual property, and rights of an artist." "What about kidnapping?" Ethan nodded, because Dad didn't seem to be thinking about Inkling's point of view at all. There was a knock on the door. Beyond the window, Ethan could make out Carl and Vitka. "Well, that was easy," Ethan's dad said, putting down the phone and walked to the door. "Peter," said Mr. Worthington, as he and Vitka entered the house, "Vitka just told me what's going on, and I wanted to set things right." "I appreciate it, Carl," said Dad. Mr. Worthington grinned and shook his head. "What an amazing thing. It certainly is." Ethan watched Vitka trying to figure out. She was silent, and her face was nervous and closed, like someone who'd just been punished. She had a backpack slung over her shoulder, and he really hoped Inkling was inside. "So where did it come from?" Carl asked as they all sat down on the living room. Ethan said, "Not it. He came from my dad's sketchbook. He felt like it was his story to tell since he's heard it directly from Inkling. One night, all of the ink ran together into a big blob, and he pulled himself off the page." Wow, Mr. Worthington said. If I hadn't already seen him, I wouldn't believe a word of this. I couldn't. Believe me, said Dad. I had the same reaction. So how long have you had him? Not very long. Mr. Worthington raised his eyebrows. You haven't been using him in all these years? What? Dad looked offended. Hey, it's okay, said Mr. Worthington, lifting his hands. Maybe every artist has one of those things. How do I know? I'm just a publisher. Ethan heard the anger in his dad's voice. I can assure you, Carl, this is the very recent turn of events. I'm sorry. It's just that his work looks so much like yours. Because he came from my dad's ink, Ethan told him. That makes sense, said Mr. Worthington, but Ethan couldn't tell if he was really, truly convinced. So he's come free from a sketchbook and now has a life of his own? So it seems, Dad said. He took a breath. I appreciate you guys coming over. He looked at Vidka. Thanks for bringing him back. Oh, we're not bringing him back, said Mr. Worthington. What do you mean? Ethan demanded. His eyes snapped from Mr. Worthington to Vidka, and he now understood the expression on her face, not shame, but cunning. So where is he? Dad asked. Somewhere very safe, said Carl. He's a slippery fella. You kidnapped him, Ethan shouted. We want him back. You're talking about him like he's a real person, Mr. Worthington said, smiling. Yeah, he is. Dad put a calming hand on Ethan's arm. Carl, he doesn't belong to you. But if he's a person, how can he belong to anyone? Dad sniffed in impatience. Carl, he came from my sketchbook. He's made from my ink, my imagination. And Vidka stole him from my backpack, Ethan added. That may be, said Mr. Worthington, but it doesn't mean you own him. And maybe Inkling just wants to do his own thing now. A change. He drew for you, but he's already drawn for us too. A cold surge went through Ethan's veins. Was it true? He'd known Inkling longer than anyone had. Inkling was his friend. He'd said that he didn't want to leave. So how could he go and draw for someone else, especially Vidka? It seems he just likes to draw, Mr. Worthington went on. I knew it, Ethan said to Vidka. You just want him to draw for you. As if you don't, she retorted. I have bigger plans than that, Mr. Worthington said, and they include all of us. I see a wonderful collaboration ahead. You've got him trapped in a jar, Ethan said. I saw it. Yes, the spy copter, said Mr. Worthington with a little wince. I wasn't going to bring that up. That's trespassing, an invasion of privacy. You can get in a lot of trouble for that. Just like stealing, said Ethan's dad. You're very welcome to call the police, said Mr. Worthington. Ethan and his dad were both silent. They knew how crazy it sounded. They could never go to the police. It would make a great headline, said Mr. Worthington. Blocked artist accuses publisher of stealing magical ink. And even if anyone believed you, then you would have to fess up that you never actually created your own books. That's such a lie, said Ethan. Mr. Worthington ignored him. Peter, I'm not taking Inkling away from you. Of course you can have access to him to finish your project. I'll be moving him to the Prominence office soon, and you can work with him there. But Inkling never leaves the building. Also, whenever Inkling produces with you will be published by me, as well as anything else Inkling might make on his own. How's that fair? Said Ethan. Mr. Worthington scarcely glanced at him. Ethan, let me and your dad do the talking, okay? Why don't you guys go watch TV? No, said Ethan and Vidka at exactly the same time, then glared at each other. We want him back, Ethan said. You seem pretty attached to this little guy, and you both obviously have a great working relationship with him. Maybe you can oversee some other projects for Inkling, ones of our choosing, of course. Ethan saw his father's chest rise and fall heavily. Carl, we've known each other for a long time. We've had a lot of success together, and more than that, you and Celine were so great to us when Olivia died. But this is not right. Mr. Worthington dipped his head thoughtfully and was silent for a moment before saying, we see things differently, Peter. This is an opportunity for both of us. Right, Dad said dubiously. We both need Inkling, said Mr. Worthington. Admit it, Peter. You need him too. But the brutal truth is, we don't really need you anymore. Now that we have Inkling, he's an amazing content creator. Those comics I showed you, the ones you were too high and mighty to do, I bet Inkling won't have a problem doing them. He won't do them, Ethan said. Not for you. Well, maybe you can help convince him. You're stealing, Carl, Ethan's dad said. That word again, said Mr. Worthington. How can you steal something that doesn't belong to anyone? Let him out of the jar then, said Ethan. Let him out and see what he does. Carl smiled calmly at Ethan's hand. You have my offer. It's a good one. I really hope you take it. He put his hand on Vitka's shoulder, and they stood and let themselves out, closing the door softly behind them. They can't do this, Ethan fumed. He wanted to smash things. He settled for smacking his hand against the wall until it stung with pain. Dad took his hand in both of his to stop him. It's not fair, Ethan said, and realized his face was wet. It'll be okay, Dad said. We'll figure something out.